during this 2 days, I think it's tomorrow, you will have a presentation on Westology, on what the sort of research we're conducting on this subject. Yeah, by Abhinav Pandurangi. Yes, absolutely. And so I invite you to attend his lecture, because I think you will get a glimpse of what I think can be done in that domain. Thank you.
Study the West. Let's take a look at the West and some of its problems. So I've titled this presentation A Journey into the Web of the West, as you can see, and you will come to see why as we move throughout the presentation. So the West is many things. It is a collection of, it's not one thing, it's a collection of states, corporations, cultures, cultural patterns, and other entities of all kinds. Today, many of these things are at war with each other. Has anyone been following what is going on in America since the Trump election? Okay. Anyone thinking that Donald Trump has made America stronger, of course, may not understand that landscape. First and foremost, I want to say the West is not a threat. It is now weaker than it has ever been on account of the infighting, which I just previously mentioned. This internal struggle has become endemic at every level and in every segment of Western society. It is not much of a stretch to say that the West is currently dying of a cultural self-poisoning. So rejecting the West wholesale is not an option. Every culture in the world is already a hybrid, with many traits adopted from the West, which are now too deeply entangled into their cultural fabric to realistically be pulled out. Okay. Therefore, to understand Western philosophical thought in detail, the poisonous elements must be separated from valuable inputs. And keep in mind, this is a cursory examination of what I call Westology and what Professor Vidvat Pandurangi has also referred to as Westology in the past, and what Dr. Raymond would also refer to as Westology. So this is to inspire some thought and then to open up some discussion and possibly more research into these type of things. So we want to set that landscape and see where we can go with that. Okay. So like I said, we want to separate poisonous elements from valuable inputs. So this is not an easy task because many aspects of Western culture tend to masquerade under deceptive labels. Okay. So much so that even Westerners themselves generally do not understand what purpose some of these labels serve. I spent 34 years in the United States of America. I was born and raised there. So I can certainly attest to this fact. Contrary to appearances, Western culture is not materialistic though. And sometimes it can be perceived as being materialistic. Okay? The very idea of a culture being materialistic that doesn't really work. Culture is sort of, this is an oxymoron. Okay? Culture in its very nature is spiritual. Culture is not about things. It is about ideas and mental attitudes. Culture is about Purusha, not Prakriti. Okay? So, yet it is undeniable that in the West, the spiritual dimension is always hidden under a thick armor of apparent materialism. Okay? As a result, one can often fail to perceive it. A considerable amount of effort is therefore required in order to decipher the Western culture. So now, Indian philosophical thought has all the tools in order to perform this decipherment. India has long ago identified and experimented with all possible spiritual margas. Many of these margas are also present in Western culture in one form or another, although they are seldom labeled as such, nor are they identified as spiritual constructs from a Western point of view. Let's consider a few examples. Okay. Let's look at some unseen connections. In India, cows are treated as spiritual animals in an open and unproblematic way. People will routinely touch them in the street, certain people, and also on account of their auspicious nature. Okay? Other aspects of Hindu religion and Hindu religious practice also involve them in one form or another. In the West, dogs occupy a similar position. Okay? They are considered good for children. They are called man's best friend. And they appear at every level of Western social life. Recently, during the funeral of US President George H.W. Bush, that was George Bush's father, a dog is shown guarding the casket, his funeral casket, here. As you can see, the American flag is draped over the casket, and this is his dog here. If this man's death is not an important event, then I don't know what it is. To have a dog shows a very strong connection, okay, that man has with this animal. This is a spiritual connection. This dog had been gifted to the deceased president by a Veterans Association a few years earlier and is shown performing a sort of ritual wake in a manner that is eerily reminiscent of ancient Egyptian rituals surrounding the dog god Anubis. So, however, most Westerners would not agree that dogs are sacred animals in their culture. They would insist that people like dogs for more practical reasons or for a simple emotional reason. Okay, it's a relatively simple reason. But should we accept this at face value? Probably not. Okay. It is quite obvious that the similarity between the behaviors of Westerners towards their dogs, okay, and that of many Hindus towards cows seems to indicate that something of a spiritual nature is afoot. Further confirmation of this evidence can be obtained by considering the symbolic value of dogs in Western culture. Dogs represent faithfulness and devotion. They embody bhakti and shraddha. Okay, shraddha. The overwhelming majority of Westerners are completely oblivious to the spiritual dimension of their relationship with their beloved pets. Postmodern Western culture often makes efforts to hide or deny its connection to anything with a strong overarching spiritual or religious connotation. However, no culture can be understood without first building an accurate picture of its spiritual underpinnings. Another example is the way Western culture considers its own popular music scene. To most educated Westerners, popular singers like Madonna or Michael Jackson represent everything that is wrong about their culture. Okay? They consider them musically indigent, sometimes vulgar, and crassly commercialized. However, there are some manifestations of Western popular music which are considered by educated Westerners in a more favorable light, although they are outwardly very similar to the average pop music concert. One such event is called the Burning Man Festival, and this festival is held each year in the Nevada desert in late summer. There, university professors and Silicon Valley professionals alike congregate in the tens of thousands for a few days to mingle with artists and dance all night to the sound of rave music. it's a little bit like left-hand tantra, but they won't admit it. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. Okay, we see a lot of different things happening there. What's interesting is while they will chastise, let's say, a simple like Madonna or a pop concert, if you go to these professionals in Palo Alto, they're very successful people by many measures in terms of how well they've done, or a lot of the university professors out there in California, they'll say, oh, no, Burning Man, that is an extremely intellectual pursuit. I don't know what you're talking about. That is not like something bad. This is good stuff. So it's interesting, okay, that how they do this. Of course, all kinds of substances are freely available during this Burning Man festival. And those people that you saw there are not children. I want to reiterate again. They're not just. These are university professors and Silicon Valley professionals whose term sheet is in the hundreds of millions range. Okay, and they take drugs for 4 or 5 days and go on these, big excursions. Okay, so what we can say is, why are such events considered good in some Western circles, even though the behavior of the attendees is pointless and even sometimes repulsive? Okay, from an Indian perspective, the answer to this question is easy. Burning Man and similar events are the Western version of Vamachara. Okay, Vamachara. The professionals of Silicon Valley lead a double life. Okay, they are respectable grihastas by day, okay, all year, but practitioners of Kulamarga at Burning Man Festival. Okay. One could go on mentioning similar aspects of Western culture in an endless list. So we will limit ourselves to just one more example. The Apollo moon landing, 1960s, late 1960s in the West. This event is billed as a triumph of technology and industrial might. Indeed, that it is. It certainly was an achievement. But one must ask questions which explore other motivations of this endeavor. Why did 1960s America decide to embark on such a costly project, even though it had no immediate practical value? Purpose to all this. Okay, so now we should talk about it. The religious dimension of the Apollo mission is even more readily apparent, okay, when one remembers that the co-pilot of the lunar module, whose name was Buzz Aldrin, he performed a Christian Eucharist sacrifice just after he touched down on the moon.
Neil, there's something I'd like to do if you don't mind. I cleared it with Deke. After all the grief that Frank and the others got for reading from Genesis, I can't be specific, but something I want to do. Okay. Houston, Tranquility, over.
Tranquility, Houston, go ahead.
Roger, this is the LEM pilot. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever or wherever they may be, to pause a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours. And to give thanks in his or her own way. Over.
Roger, Tranquility Base.
I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit. For you can do nothing without me.
So as you can see, one noteworthy aspect of this event is that it was kept secret, okay, at the time, and only revealed several decades afterwards in his memoirs. Okay, this raises an obvious question: why was the religious ritual kept secret if it was the whole point of the Apollo endeavor? It was one of the main points, as we just explained. Remember, this is Christianity sort of versus atheism. Russia represents atheism. Okay, in this context, America represents Christianity in this way. So why was it kept secret? Okay. So this is one instance in which we can see how the West is starting to be at war with itself. I mean, these things, these conflicting ideas that the West has with its own coherency, especially that America has with its own structural coherency, started to happen long ago. And the specific reason is that NASA forbade the astronauts from revealing the Apollo 11 Eucharist ceremony is because it was then facing a lawsuit brought on by an atheist association over the previous instance of the overt religious expression by the NASA astronauts. A few months earlier, they had, on Apollo 8, those who was on the mission had expressed that they wanted to read a passage from the Bible, okay, and it was during a television broadcast. So following this, the American atheists, a fringe group led by Madeleine O'Hare, brought a lawsuit against NASA for violating the constitutional separation between church and state on an account of the fact that the astronauts were government employees. So it would eventually be decided in favor of the atheist plaintiff, and no American government employee would ever be able to make any religious statement ever again. As a result, the religiously devout majority of Americans who were able to beat the atheist Russia through the performance of the Apollo Gurula Mela, this is like through this performance, okay? However, they could not defeat the lonely crackpot atheist lady who was battling them through their own court system. In two of the three examples above, Christianity was mentioned as a significant factor. This is no surprise, of course, since Christianity held until recently an undisputed and long-standing monopoly on spirituality in Western culture. Until, let us say, the end of the 19th century, the Western spiritual landscape was much clearer than it is now. All or nearly all things spiritual were related to and contained within Christianity. Everything was called secular, a word which has a very different use from the one it has now, and simply at that time meant everything that is not directly related to Christianity and therefore not considered spiritual. So in the course of the 20th century, a long drawn-out process of de-Christianization occurred in the West. So much so that the atheists, agnostics, non-practicing, non-believers, and Christians far outnumbered practicing Christians in the West, on the whole. I mean, if you go to places like San Francisco or New York, okay, other very metropolitan places in Los Angeles, and say, I'm a Christian, people will look at you funny. If people who are Christians say they're Christians in certain circles, it's an embarrassment. Because America is not now a religious place. They've moved away from that. And this is one of the primary reasons for so many of these issues that we're seeing, and why it comes out in all these other ways. So the barrier that used to separate the religious from the non-religious became blurred. In the West nowadays, it is the done thing to pretend that every aspect of life has become non-religious for a majority of people. Okay? However, Christianity remains the key to understanding Western spiritual foundations, and hence its innermost mechanisms. Although Christianity is now, today, again, mostly a rotting corpse of its earlier self. Okay? Its intellectual categories and vocabulary still structure the way Western thought conceives anything spiritual. There is no surprise, as Christianity was the only living philosophical religious sampradaya in existence in the West for roughly 1500 years. Yet Christianity is widely misunderstood, okay, both in the West and elsewhere. To many people, Christianity remains a baffling mystery, especially considering its formerly very widespread success despite doctrines and practices which often appear frankly bizarre and quite unappealing to many. The reason for this situation is that Christianity is impossible to analyze within the Christian framework. Okay? As stated above, the spiritual toolset available in Western thought is mostly Christian legacy and cannot be used to analyze itself. It cannot be used to analyze itself. Christianity, now we can look at Christianity through an Indian philosophical scope. Okay? From an Indian perspective, Christianity appears much less intractable. As we have said above, Indian thought has all the tools required in order to decipher Christianity. All it needs is enough self-confidence in its conceptual categories and analytical methods. First and foremost, one must realize that Christianity is simply a sampradaya. Am I pronouncing that right? Sampradaya. Fairly similar to most Hindu sampradaya. Okay. Christianity developed in an environment similar to the Indian religious landscape and the late Roman Empire. For a long time, it was a fairly marginal sampradaya. And it had to compete with many other religious movements. Over time, it developed all the various components that most Indian sampradaya possesses. A philosophical doctrine, darshana, a ritual orthopraxy called a liturgy, a monastic institution similar to Hindu Math, and a yoga like sadhana. This last aspect is the least understood, and yet it is the key to understanding the whole. The yoga like sadhana. Christianity is rooted in Judaism, which is a bhakti marga, fairly similar to the contemporary early Bhagavata movement. Christianity developed from this Jewish foundation by emphasizing and intensifying its property, its property aspects. Christianity was not exclusively a property movement. Indeed, some of its early branches developed from a jnana yoga. However, after the 5th century AD, when Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion, its property exclusive branch became dominant and was able to eliminate all the other branches. The attitude which triumphed at the time within the Christian movement is not without some parallel. This sentiment is expressed by the shlokas in the Bhagavata Puranas below. This is Bhagavata Puranas 5, 6, and 7. I will read it in English. I will not try to pronounce it in Sanskrit, lest I make a fool of myself. Krishna said, "Because I desire what is best for man, I have stated 3 sorts of spiritual practice. The paths of knowledge, the action and devotion, bhakti. Besides these 3, there is no other means to spiritual elevation anywhere at all. The spiritual exercise of knowledge is appropriate for those who, being repulsed by the sensory world, have renounced action in this world. The spiritual exercise of works, on the other hand, is appropriate for those who, not being repulsed by the sensory world, are still subject to desire. But that man in whom, by chance, his faith awakened as he hears, for instance, of my deeds, who is neither resigned nor overly attached to sensory things, upon him does the spiritual exercise of devotion bestow perfection." Yes.
5 minutes.
5 more minutes. Okay. So this is why again, seen from an Indian perspective, it is clear that the core of Christianity is a sadhana practice for the sake of moksha. However, in order to fulfill its own standards of property, Christianity must deny that it is such a thing, because the practitioner might conceive some notion of his own merit and thus deviate from the absolute property. From within Christianity, salvation, or if you will, moksha, has to appear to be coming exclusively out of God's grace. This is why the Christian doctrine appears so bizarre from the outside. In order to avoid disclosing its yoga-like nature to its own practitioners, Christianity has to hide its method of action through the sets of obscure revelations when in fact it functions very similar to a meditation technique. As a result, we can say Christianity is a Shraddha-based yoga. A Shraddha-based yoga. And is therefore only effective if the practitioner believes that things like hell, universal sin, and the crucifixion really existed. So in reality, these beliefs can more accurately be described as mental asanas, rather than as statements of fact. Finally, we can assert that Christianity cannot do that lest it completely loses its effectiveness. If it does that, it will completely lose its effectiveness. Thank you.